Welcome to our next presentation by Ankita Shanker. I will first introduce her quickly and then she will start her presentation. So Ankita Shanker earned her postgraduate degree in law from Oxford University and is now a doctoral fellow working on an interdisciplinary PhD titled Resolving Inconsistencies within the Law to Safeguard the Fundamental Rights of Non-Human Animals. She also acts as a pro bono consultant composing law and policy recommendations to the EU on behalf of the Dutch Coalition of Animal NGOs and an advisor to a number of NGOs. Ankita's research and practice are dedicated to safeguarding the fundamental rights of all right bearers. In her presentation today, Ankita addresses what it will take for us to live in a world without subjugations, one in which there is, at minimum, formal recognition of any respect for the fundamental rights of all right bearers. She will discuss why such a world is needed and how we can achieve it through policy, law, and activism. So welcome, Ankita.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to IARC for having me here and to everyone who is here and watching for being here. In my last presentation, I discussed the issues associated with the current legal status of animals and the wider implications of this status. Today, I want to discuss some strategies I have identified through my research and practice that might help address some of these issues. First, key terms. By animals, I mean all members of the animal kingdom other than Homo sapiens, and by humans, I mean Homo sapiens. By personhood, I mean the status of being a person. And by fundamental rights, I mean strong inherent rights that can be contrasted with weak, externally conferred juristic rights, such as those that are derived from animal welfare protection. Before I begin, I also want to provide an explanatory note on my strategy. So much as we may want to live in a vegan world and we may want this to happen overnight, it is a factual reality that change takes concerted strategic effort and time. Human societies have relied on animal use and exploitation since the beginning, and this is now institutionalized and deeply rooted in our cultures. So once upon a time, it may have served some evolutionary advantage, but today, for many of us, animal use and exploitation are entirely unnecessary for our survival. Our continued existence as a species does not depend on using or exploiting animals. In fact, it depends on us stopping this, especially when we consider the broader picture, the long-term health and environmental impact of things like animal agriculture or fishing. But anyway, the point I want to make here is no matter how badly we want it and no matter how hard we try, the system will not change immediately. So while in an ideal world, I would be addressing the issue from the sole perspective of fundamental animal rights, and this is in fact what my doctoral research concerns, today in the real world, I want to discuss animal protection more broadly as well. While full, strong animal rights protection is the ultimate goal, we also need to make use of and develop welfare provisions for interim protection until we are able to reach our end goal. This is because we already have the resources for the latter and the former is still a little way away. For the victims, some protection, even if imperfect or unsound in principle, is clearly better than no protection. To demonstrate exactly why we need a broader focus at this stage, I have picked a few cases to show exactly where we are in terms of legally protecting fundamental rights and personhood of animals across the world. So the first three cases listed on the slide are part of a very, very limited bit of jurisprudence that actually purportedly recognizes animal rights for personhood. Even these cases, however, which arguably represent the epitome of pro-animal rights jurisprudence, only protect the personhood or rights of the individual animals involved in those litigations. And they do this on a case-by-case basis. What this means is that there is nothing general or universal about the protection here. These decisions might make some sweeping declarations, but in the jurisdictions where they originate, just as nearly everywhere else in the world, animal exploitation in general is entirely legal and quite rampant. But these cases give us hope because legal recognition precedes legal provisions, and maybe These will form the foundation for a strong legal culture of respecting animals and their rights and their personhood someday. However, for now, this does not appear to have happened because such judicial decisions are extremely rare and quite difficult to translate into broader legal practice. And this is because of the rampant human use and exploitation of animals that I referred to earlier. So the decisions in the cases brought by the Non-Human Rights Project in the USA with remarkably strong arguments, and this is represented on the last point of the slide, is far more representative of how such cases are normally decided, in refusal to recognize or protect animal rights or personhood, often based on misunderstanding or misapplication of legal doctrines. And while efforts remain underway to clarify these legal doctrines and to achieve fundamental protections, we must make use of whatever animal protection laws we have at our disposal or can easily develop in the meantime. Then, strategies for policies. So first, I believe efforts need to be made on a global level. The scholar Ann Peters has written extensively on this, and it is of paramount importance that we understand just how important this is. Isolated nation states can only do so much in terms of law and policy. If we want strong, universal animal rights or even welfare, what we need is a global system with international actors such as multinational organizations and nation states all playing their respective roles in setting and continuously raising the standard of protection of animal interests. This would impose obligations on a domestic level as well, on states to ensure a common standard of animal protection is developed and maintained world over. The reason that this is that international and regional efforts have far-reaching scope and cannot be undone at the domestic level. This is precisely how human rights laws developed as well, through the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was then followed by various binding treaties on specific issues, and then we had domestic laws world over. The animal welfare regulations of the EU are really good examples of how efforts by supranational organizations can improve animal protection in an entire region and even beyond, because they have extraterritorial impacts on producers in third countries through trade regulation. And second, as a pragmatic matter, animal rights workers ought to link the animal protection movement with other causes and other movements. So in my last presentation, I described some of the wider impacts of animal exploitation on our planet in general, as well as on humans in particular. And I highlight these to maximize support, not to detract from our message. That things are interconnected is a social reality, and through joint actions, we can address the world's most pressing problems more effectively, side by side with others who are trying to change the status quo. The only caution I would urge is that in these inter-cause or movement collaborations, we should not lose focus from the priority we afford animal interests, or subjugate these interests for other goals. In fairness, all of these aims typically complement and not compete with each other, so this may be more of a theoretical point, but it is, I feel, an important one to remember nonetheless. On the international plane, I would propose that we start with jurisdically conferring rights drawn from animal welfare laws, which again are different from fundamental animal rights, to protect the most pressing of animal interests. Something is better than nothing, and this is only until we have the adequate resources needed to protect animal rights fully. As mentioned, we already have the resources for robust welfare protection, well, as robust as welfare protection can be. So this would be faster and easier, which is good for an entire measure and as a first step. But of course, the journey would not end here. I have written some policy proposals on this, and without going into too much detail, I will mention a few key aspects of the content that I have identified in this process. I will emphasize again that I am in no way condoning any form of animal exploitation, but I'm urging protections that can easily be achieved given our current social reality until we are able to change that reality itself. So regulating is easier than banning, and where the latter cannot be realistically achieved immediately, we should at least regulate how animals are used by humans until these activities are banned altogether. For this, an important factor is ensuring minimum protections for the welfare of animals. So my proposals usually entail things like prohibiting animal abuse at all costs, which I then distinguish from non-abusive use or exploitation, which should be strongly regulated to the extent that they're still legal. Then it involves strategies such as identifying the permitted purposes for such use or exploitation in order to absolutely prevent exploitation for things like sport or entertainment. I also propose leaving wild animals alone, and in the case of animals that are held captive, to at the very least ensure that their basic needs are met, by which I mean appropriate food and water, housing, transport, care, rest, leisure, intellectual stimulation, as well as access to their natural environment, to their natural behaviors, and to their natural social interactions. Another aspect to look at is to issue sector-specific protections that are tailored for the various sectors like agriculture, aquaculture, science, and service, as well as imposing regulations on hunting or fishing or trading in animals and their parts and products, and also controlling animals that are deemed as pests. It's also very important to ensure information awareness and competence requirements. Consumer awareness and information, particularly through labeling products that use animals or their parts anywhere in the supply chain, can help consumers make informed decisions. Public education and awareness about things like veganism, and particularly in schools, is really essential so that people can be taught more about these compassionate ideals from a young age, which can then hopefully, it's hoped it can change their behavior as they grow up. And handler and associated person awareness and training and competence requirements, which need to be regularly updated and tested for anyone that interacts with animals, so that we know that they're at least in non-abusive hands to some extent. Trade and finance regulations have an important role to play as well. So states could be obliged to allocate funding for campaigns and for research that find alternatives to animal abuse and exploitation. They could impose higher taxes on animal-reliant products and even higher ones on those that entail poor welfare standards, and issue subsidies for products that do not involve animal use or exploitation, and the highest ones being reserved for properly vegan products that are beneficial for not just the animals, but for the planet and for the people. Then we look to external trade regulations, which could put pressure on producers even outside borders, so in third countries and global producers, to comply with animal protection standards. So the EU banned cosmetic testing, and this, excuse me, and this actually prompted many global cosmetic companies to change their practices world over and invest in finding alternatives to animal testing, which is certainly a step in the right direction. In terms of enforcement, imposing responsibility on states backed by sanctions will ensure that nation states are ensure basically animal protection within their borders. And independent authorities can be set up to ensure compliance by and within states. Domestically, states can use criminal legal measures, such as create more offenses and undertake more prosecutions and impose higher and actually proportionate sanctions for violations of animal laws in order to maximize animal protection. The ultimate goal is, of course, international animal rights law. And this is a topic on which I'm planning a doctoral project next year. So by the end of that, I will have far more details to share. But for now, here is a very brief outline. As soon as we have developed the resources, I propose we really do need to move on to protecting the fundamental rights and personhood of animals. Multinational instruments on animal rights and personhood should be entered into, and these can do two very key things. First, they can recognize and protect animal interests, and second, they can impose obligations on nation states to do so domestically through their own laws and policies. We also need enforcement obligations on the nation states themselves. And this would function much in the same way as I mentioned in the previous slide. Then we have domestic laws. Regional and international changes would need to be reflected within nation states as well, so the members of these organizations, and in their domestic laws and their domestic policies. So this would mean that the content of public as well as private laws would need to change. On the slide, I've listed a few examples of areas in which such changes are very clearly necessary, such as constitutional law, rights law, and criminal law within the realm of public law, as well as property law within the realm of private law. And again, criminal sanctions would be an essential way to enforce these obligations within borders. Lastly, a word on activism. So why we need it for legal and policy change. Well, first, we need more people to join the movement in order to actually get law and policy changes in any functioning democracy, where people collectively decide on laws and policies. And secondly, individual choices made by consumers do have an impact. And so often I hear that they don't really matter, and it is just the actions of large MNCs that are responsible for the problems of animal exploitation. But where do people think those MNCs get the money to carry out these actions? Mostly consumers, either directly or indirectly. If there were no demand, supply would be rather pointless, and consumers switching to plant products can and have in the past driven out businesses out of business or encourage them to switch over to producing or selling plant-based products. If more of us were to make that switch, we could push change by bigger businesses and on a much larger scale. So then the question becomes what type of activism and why? And I would promote appealing to reason. First, if we want to change laws and policies, this appeal to reason would be more relevant. Appealing to sentiment is likely to change hearts, and a lot of people are fairly immune to it, but legal policy changes tend to be permanent and they tend to last a bit longer. So there's that. And secondly, every activist is an ambassador for their cause, whether they like it or not. It detracts from the credibility of any movement if vocal parts of it espouse notions that defy the underlying rationale for the movement. The fact of the matter is, as vegans and animal rights activists, we are already in the minority. So people view other people as composites, and people also will take any excuse they can to discredit those whose views cause them discomfort, maybe by forcing them to reconsider or reevaluate their own actions. While I would never advocate diluting our message, I would prompt delivering it backed by solid reason. So how do we appeal to reason? First, I argue that we must always leave room for nuance in application, rather than prescribing a rigid rulebook. There really is only one principle, and that is choosing the path of least harm at every juncture where a choice is available. So first, this implies actually having a choice to begin with. It is, of course, true that some people do not have a choice or have a very limited one. But the idea is still simple. Be vegan in the choices you do make. In that sense, it can be easily accessible to everyone. Veganism in practice, though, might not look the same for everyone. So this is an example I often give. In parts of the world, certain parts of the world, back-breaking animal labor is used in industries, and it is so intrinsic that it's used to grow and produce pretty much everything in these areas. It is absolutely unavoidable if you were to go to these areas and want to buy even a single product at a market. And in some of these parts, dairy farming is, or at least pre-globalization was, unindustrialized and done via family herds with good welfare. So in situations like this, maybe the vegan path would have looked different than what it would in industrialized, globalized parts of the world. So here, how would we choose between the lesser, how would we choose the lesser of two evils? And I point this out to show that there are issues like this of which we must be aware, and that these are the kinds of questions we should ask and answer at every decision-making point. instead of adopting a one-size-fits-all approach, at least until a vegan world is within reaching distance. So if we look at veganism as a philosophy, which it is, rather than simply a diet, which it is not, we have to acknowledge room for nuance, because that is what happens when you take a moral principle and you apply it to facts. Secondly, we must go where reason takes us. So I have seen sort of posts over the internet on issues such as throwing out food for cross-contamination or killing mosquitoes in self-defense. And one issue I would like to focus on in particular is people very vocally encouraging throwing away pre-owned animal products upon going vegan, or throwing out food because it's been cross-contaminated. Now, objectively, these actions cause waste and do not make the animals who have suffered any less dead or tortured. Moreover, replacing these items will also add to suffering and waste, because even plant products are not entirely cruelty or waste-free. They are the best alternative out there, but virtually nothing is entirely free of at least incidental harm. So in situations like these, what really is the vegan thing to do? And it is also important to ask this question, because we need to see if the action that we are advocating is truly in line with the vegan philosophy. The philosophy is our starting point, it is our foundational principle, and the logical consistency between that point and the conclusion are imperative to maintain throughout. If we don't lose sight of this, we can go where the reason takes us. And lastly, we must encourage rational discussions rather than shutting down genuine questions. We need to show the world that our philosophy is not blind dogma, but rational compassion. And this does mean answering questions, and it does mean explaining those answers, and it may even mean debating them. So with that, I would like to conclude my session today on using law, policy, and activism to achieve a world without subjugation. And we can now move on to the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and all those information you gave to us. And I will encourage all of you to still ask some questions, but we can start already. So the first question would be, do you think that welfare paves the way towards animal rights?
Yes, absolutely, because I think it gets people considering issues of animal interests, which wasn't really a thing until, well, relatively recently in human history. So it starts this dialogue and this discussion, and eventually, I think, even on a personal level, most vegans and animal rights workers I know today started out with notions of welfare because we were concerned about what was happening to the animals. And the more we found out about it, the more we realized that they're really, we shouldn't stop short of rights. But I think it is an imperative starting point, especially when we consider realities of the way the world currently is and the way most of us are raised. So, yes.
Okay. The next question would be, do you think that legal cosmopolitanism is the ideal space for the recognition of the fundamental rights of animals?
Legal cosmopolitan. Okay, sorry, I haven't come across that term before, but legal cosmopolitan. I imagine that means something to do with the sort of globalized legal system. Okay, let's assume I do.
Maybe the person can, yeah.
Okay.
Write something else, or yeah, explain the term a little bit. But yeah.
So yes, if we look at it sort of as a globe, from a global community perspective, which I think is probably what I can extrapolate from context, yes, I definitely think that it is the best way to start and the best way to progress through with laws for animal protection and the recognition of their rights. And this is just because different states domestically have had very different histories when it comes to animal protection. And if you look at I think there's the World Animal Law Index, I can't remember the name at the moment, but it kind of ascribes a ranking of A to F or to G to every country based on their laws. And there are stark differences. So some countries have a strong legal culture and others have a weaker legal culture. And the way to get sort of universal protection would involve a concerted effort by everyone, everywhere, at all levels and in all regions. So if that is the question, that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question. Is it more efficient to start by trying first to change the society or by changing law and policy in order to change society?
I love that question. I think these efforts have to kind of go side by side, because changing laws and policies, of course, require a lot of research by academics and policymakers, and they try to put this into perspective. But then there are also the people who actually have to vote on those laws and policies, because democracy, wherever there is a democracy, of course. So I think everybody has sort of a different role to play in this, and there are people who are wonderful with people skills and they can really do a lot of outreach and get through to people, and then there are people who are perhaps more like me, who are better at doing the research and coming up with sort of policy solutions. So I think if we all stick to the skills we are really, really good at and continue our efforts, it all comes together in a wonderful way and will hopefully get us to the point where we have this world without subjugation for everyone.
Okay, that sounds perfect. Okay. There's one more question. Do you think that animal personhood is easier to achieve than animal Bill of Rights?
I think maybe it might be the other way around, because with animal personhood, and this is something I'm sort of yet to explore in my research, but it's definitely planned. I think it wouldn't necessarily entail things like animals, if they're recognized as persons, probably couldn't be treated as property. And that would drastically change the relationships between humans and animals. And a Bill of Rights, I mean, there has been a universal declaration on animal rights, but it leaves out key things like the right to life, for instance. So it's become sort of a more, I suppose, welfareist in what it does. But it was obviously a wonderful effort. So it depends, I suppose, on what the Bill of Rights would be and how many, what rights were being recognized. So these strong fundamental rights would perhaps be harder because they would entail things like life and liberty, in addition to all these other protections. But personhood would also I think personhood might even be a higher standard, because in the sense that it would change, it's associated with notions of animal dignity and might change the way we can yes, whether we can own animals, which now people can. So it would sort of change that. I suppose it's to be seen, but instinctively I would feel personhood might be a bit harder.
Another question would be, do you think that vegan politicians and vegan activists must have different approaches, meaning that activists can be more direct to the point, whereas politicians must use a middle way for negotiation, or should them use the same direct approach?
Oh, yes, I think politicians do need to do more of to use sort of more diplomatic tactics than we would allow ourselves as activists. And I've seen that this role, sort of, I wear different hats when I'm taking part in outreach activities than when I am actually drafting the policies, or so I suppose it really does depend on the audience, but politicians also are dependent on votes. And I think diplomacy is such a fundamental part of that role and of the skill set that is needed to succeed as a politician, because they need votes not just from the vegans and the animal rights people out there, because honestly, if they were contingent just on our votes, it would be where we don't make up a very large proportion of the world's population. So I think for wider appeal, diplomacy is necessary, especially in the early stages. And I think it's always a difficult balance to strike between being diplomatic, but then also not compromising the principle and the underlying principle that is the ultimate goal. So it's a skill and an art, and something that takes a lot of effort to perfect.
Yeah, that's difficult. Okay, thank you. I think we have still time for one more question. What do you think is the best way to change the law to include animal rights in the future?
So that forms the subject of my PhD, which means I'm going to try to summarize it, I suppose, in a short way. So all the strategies that I kind of referred to, we start with welfare protections, kind of build resources, start with recognizing animal rights and developing laws across various areas like criminal laws and constitutional principles to actually safeguard protection. And then there will, of course, be the part of implementing those laws that will probably realistically involve kind of a phase out of animal use and exploitation. So it will be, and it will drastically alter everything, because so much of human activity is so dependent on these terrible things that we do to animals. So it will, laws, policies, spreading awareness, civil society, throughout all the actors doing everything they can, and it will take time, but that's the best I can do to summarize it, I suppose.